So the point of this conversation is not everybody could vote, and I would say the first time there is even universal white manhood suffrage in the United States is right around 1860, right before the Civil War. And it comes primarily then for a couple of reasons. I don't want to do a big song and dance, even though it's tempting for historians, but in the 1850s, there's a huge mess with political parties. Remember, we used to have Whigs and Democrats, and then at the end of the Civil War, we're going to have Republicans, and there's no-nothings. There's just all these political parties in the 1850s all over the place. And they wanted expanded suffrage because more people voting gives them more people to vote for them. So that helped. And the other thing that makes a difference is westward expansion. Territories tended to have looser voting regulations. And they did that because, for a couple of reasons. They wanted to have more people voting because that's how you got to the point where you could become a state instead of a territory. And they also did it because they thought it might attract people to come to their areas. So you all know, because Amy Canfield was just here recently, that Wyoming's the first state to give women suffrage. And one of the reasons they did it is because they didn't have very many women, and they were really hoping to attract more to Wyoming territory, because it's a way a lot more fun to live someplace where you got several genders than one gender. Now, so 1860 or so, universal manhood suffrage, not much else. So it really is, after the Civil War period, and up until the 1960s, when, I want to be really careful about this, when some people in this room were alive, actually, and can remember that what we call voting rights are established. And they're done at the national level, often with amendments to the United States Constitution. So just think about that. There are what, 27 amendments to the Constitution. 10 of them are these Bill of Rights things, which hardly count because they probably maybe should have been part from the beginning. So only 17 times in 220 some years have we amended the Constitution. Not very often. And several times it has to do with voting rights. So a lot of voting rights are established by, we have to do it with constitutional amendment. And then there are also some pieces of national legislation. So starting from a place where states have total control of voting, we move through, especially the 20th century, where the federal government finds itself in a position of needing to make statements about voting rights. And really that's, I think, what we're talking about. So the so-called Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment that makes African American citizens and that kind of thing. The 15th Amendment says that you're not going to, that there's a right to vote regardless of color, race, or previous condition of servitude. Which I always think only government would write, you know, they want to say the word slavery, so we say previous condition of servitude. So, 15th Amendment gives black men the right to vote, which, by the way, I'm sure Amy talked about this, just right the heck out of women. They've been working for both abolition and their own rights for years. Now these black men get the right to vote, they don't, but that's a whole story for a different time. So quickly we know after Reconstruction, people in the South found ways to make it difficult, if not impossible, for black men to vote. They established poll taxes, which are exactly what they sound like. You had to pay a fee in order to vote. So of course, poor people are less able to do that. They established literacy tests. We have pretty good evidence that they gave a different test to black people than they did to white people. And some of them, they're just plain hard, or almost impossible for anybody to successfully do. And they also created, and it's a phrase that's part of our lexicon, they created a grandfather clause. And that that meant if you were a white man and you couldn't become eligible to vote any other way, you couldn't pass the literacy test and you couldn't pay the poll tax. If your grandfather had voted previously, you were entitled to vote. So even if you were illiterate and poor and you were a white man, you could vote. Clearly, no African American's grandfather voted because they had been slaves. So the grandfather clause is another way to give white people the right to vote and not black people. So, 15th Amendment, important to the League of Women Voters. Of course, the 19th Amendment expands the suffrage to women in 1920. That's important. In 1924, a piece of legislation, the Indian Citizenship Act, gave American Indians the right to vote. In 1952, the McCarran Act gave first-generation Japanese Americans the right to vote, who had even been incarcerated during World War II. That's a euphemism for put in concentration camps, but they got to vote in 1952. It took the 24th Amendment to the Constitution in 1964 to eliminate poll taxes. In 1964, 5 states still had poll taxes, and I have to look at them. Virginia, Alabama, Texas, Arkansas, and Mississippi. So it took an amendment to the Constitution to do that. And then finally later, in 1971, the 26th Amendment said that 18-year-olds had a right to vote. So this series of amendments, and a couple of laws thrown in there, that then created what we call the Votes That Can Vote. The most important piece of legislation, it's a landmark piece of legislation, I would argue, it's one of the most important pieces of legislation in United States history, is the Voting Act of 1965, which has actually been amended a few times and has come under gun in recent years. It really revolutionizes voting in this country, and I'm not a legal scholar, so my simple way to explain it is the Voting Rights Act of 1965 said that the federal government would ensure that everybody had the right to vote in this country. That it would become, instead of what the Constitution said and the 10th Amendment said, where it was all the states thing, that it was the responsibility of the federal government where necessary to make sure that people had the right to vote. Especially it was looking, it was passed in 1965. Martin Luther King Jr., gets one of the pens. Lyndon Johnson, it's one of his big accomplishments. It's at the height of the civil rights movement. So it was primarily focused on black people in the South and of getting rid of all the vestiges of these various things that made it difficult for them to vote. But it had wider implications than that in terms of the federal government basically having a piece of the action about voting rights that has continued on. It's also about that same time, 1964, 1 year earlier, that this idea, I almost hate to say this out loud, of one man for one vote, now we would say one person, one vote, the idea that you ought to have redistricting that coincides with where people live comes into play. So the short story here is that it was only about 50 years ago that the basis for what we think of as voting rights in this country is established. And they're primarily established by amendments to the United States Constitution and national pieces of legislation.